Good morning, everyone. Today I wanted to read a story to you from our Read Aloud book we were reading before we left school, Kid Presidents. Thank you again to Lila N. for bringing this in. Today we're going to be reading about George Washington, often known as the father of our country. But today we're going to read about him when he was a kid growing up. So the title of this story is going to be George Washington, Kid of the Wild Frontier. And I figured before we read our story today, it was important that we looked at a few words that are in the story. The first word you see in red is frontier. Frontier is a noun, and it refers to land or the wilderness that's beyond land that's already been settled. So a long time ago when people were discovering America, when they came to wooded areas and open plains that were unsettled, they called that the wild frontier. The next word is an expedition, and an expedition could be a noun or a verb, and it's a journey or a voyage to gather information to learn about things. The third word in pink is surveyors. Surveyors is also a noun, and it's people who study the land and study the geography of the land. The fourth word in green is bedraggled. Bedraggled is an adjective. It means dirty, tired, or worn out. And the last word I want you to pay attention to while we're reading is camaraderie. Isn't that a funny spelling? Camaraderie means verb or noun, and it means you have trust and friendship among a group of people who spend time together. So now I'd like to start reading the story to you. I hope you enjoy. George Washington, Kid of the Wild Frontier. America's first president was also one of its first heroes. The general who led the new nation's troops in its war for independence hoped to retire on his farm once the British were defeated. But whenever duty called, George Washington always answered. As a kid, that meant braving the Virginia wilderness to survey the land Americans would one day call their home. Young George Washington watched as his two older half-brothers left their native Virginia to go to school in England. He always thought he'd follow in their footsteps, but then their father died when George was 11. Now George would have to stay home and help his mother run the family farm. That wasn't the kind of life George wanted for himself. Not at all. You can see the captions there says, "Whew, this is hard work." And then, of course, the sun is smiling down, saying, "My heat is relentless." Luckily for George, another person in his life had higher aspirations for him. His half-brother Lawrence was 14 years older and an officer in the British Army. George looked up to Lawrence. He was impressed by his officer's uniform, the gleaming scabbard on his side, and the dignified way he carried himself. Lawrence looked at his younger sibling and saw a miniature version of himself. With a little polish, he thought this farm boy could someday become an officer too. In the summer of 1746, Lawrence arranged for George to sign on as a midshipman in the British Navy. George couldn't have been more excited. He packed his sea bag and hurried out the door to report to his ship. And there he is running up. He's saying, "This is awesome." Then his mother stepped in. "Absolutely not," Mary Washington said. No son of hers was going away to sea, especially when she needed his help on the farm, so she ordered George to unpack his bag and instructed Lawrence to find him a job closer to home. And there's a funny picture of her carrying him off the ship. Just when he thought he was going to board the ship, here she comes. George was devastated by his mother's decision. Now it seemed he would never leave the safety of the plantation. He moped around, dreaming of far-off places like the ones Lawrence had visited, convinced he would never follow in his older brother's footsteps. Then Lawrence came through with another brainstorm. His wealthy in-laws had purchased a parcel means land, in the western Virginia wilderness, and they were sending about a dozen men to map the land. With his love of the outdoors and his knack for mathematics, George was the perfect choice to help with this task. George couldn't believe his good fortune. This mission might even be better than the sea voyage. All the adventure, all the camaraderie, but with zero chance of drowning, or so he figured. And because he would be gone for only 30 days, never even leaving Virginia's soil, his mother could not object. The expedition started out quietly enough. George recorded all of his observations in a small notebook that he titled A Journal of My Journey Over the Mountains. Nothing remarkable happened, he observed on the second day of his journey. He spent most of the third day admiring the beautiful sugar trees that dotted the Virginia wilderness. For the next month, George kept all extensive diary, writing down every detail of his trek through the Virginia frontier. There's a funny picture here of a bear walking up to him. Hey, anything interesting in that book there? And he's saying, nah. With every passing day, the journey became more challenging. One night, George discovered his bed was full of lice, fleas, and ticks. Oh, I'm starting to miss my home, he thought. Right then and there, George resolved to spend the rest of his expedition sleeping outside in the open air beside a campfire. The very next day, it began to rain. About a week into the survey, the downpour was so bad that the Potomac River crested 6 feet higher than usual. That means it rose above 6 feet higher. Crested means the top. George and his companions were forced to swim their horses to the other side. They emerged from the brackish water, soaked to the bone. I might end up drowning after all, he thought. The next day, the surveyors continued their trip by canoe as another torrential storm buffeted them from the heavens. Finally, at about 2 o'clock in the afternoon, the skies cleared, and that's when the Indians arrived. So, why are they so soaking wet? I don't know, beats me, they said. There were about 30 of them, and George was terrified. He had never encountered a Native American war party before. What would they do? How would he defend himself if they attacked? As the Indian visitors came closer, George realized they were more interested in dancing than fighting. The war party cleared a large circle and built a big fire in the center. Then they gathered around the fire and began to dance. A drummer kept the beat and a pot of water with the deerskin stretched tightly over it. George had never seen anything like it, and it was totally different than he had expected. George would have many such experiences in his remaining days on the surveying expedition. He hunted wild turkeys, learned to cook over an open fire, and even encountered his first rattlesnake. And right there's a slogan. It says, "Don't tread on me," which means don't walk on me, don't bother me, it means. When the expedition came to an end, George returned home, convinced that the life of the outdoors was the life for him. The other members of the expedition had grown to like George. They spoke highly of him to other people, and eventually the lieutenant governor of Virginia invited George to join the militia. It was the beginning of a long and glorious military career. Many years later, as general of the armies in the American colonies would struggle for their independence, George Washington led a small band of revolutionary soldiers across the frozen Delaware River. He and his bedraggled men were forced to hunker down in makeshift huts during a long, wet Pennsylvania winter. These dangerous missions would have tested the mettle of even the greatest commander, but Washington was well prepared to survive such adversity because of the time he had spent as a boy in the wild Virginia frontier. And he said, hey, a kid could even handle this weather. And that's it. I hope everyone enjoyed the book. Thank you again, Lila N., for bringing it in. Next week, I'll read another story about a different president. Hope you're doing well and working hard. I miss you all.